4th edition was certainly one of the D&D editions of all time. It was a pretty wild era if you were around back then. It was rather polarizing. One of the most commonly brought up arguments was that it was too video gamey, too much like it was trying to be an MMO or World of Warcraft specifically. And if you ask me, Pathfinder 2nd edition is far more video gamey in far worse ways, but that's a whole different topic. Can't wait for all the comments to be about this remark again instead of the actual video. What 4th edition definitely did well was creativity. It really tried to make its mark on the world by doing things differently. And sure, it was hit and miss in some ways, like the way it butchered the Forgotten Realms, but it shined in different classes, which we talked about in a previous video, and the races that they invented. And this is what I really wanted to talk about today. The weird and unique and different races of 4th edition of D&D. 4E invented or reinvented several races, and to get out of the way the ones we're not talking about today, it's primarily two categories. The races that it didn't invent, and the races that weren't forgotten. By far the two most popular races that really came out of 4th edition were the Dragonborn and the Tieflings. And believe me, they too faced their opposition at the time from people who would remark that such monstrosities would be killed on sight on their world. And I'm really terrified of the kind of world and writer, but dragons and demons are really popular topics. Neither of these, however, have been invented by 4th edition, just reimagined from the less known or less unique designs of previous editions. And then they really took off. Another race I will skip is the Eladrin, the race that 4th edition tried to use to replace High Elves. It was also a reimagining of an earlier planar concept, but they aren't entirely forgotten today either. They stuck around to some degree, even if they're not as popular as Tieflings. Hell, I got to write an Eladrin backstory for my Fiverr gig. Finally, the Goliaths were a race that also originated from a little-known 3rd edition supplement and really shot up in popularity thanks to their inclusion in the main player handbooks. Not as popular as Tieflings or Dragonborn, but they are certainly a recognizable race now. So let's now get to the actual forgotten races of 4th edition of D&D. Davas as a race were a response to the popularity of the Tieflings. Introduced in Player's Handbook 2, Davas were, just like the Eladrin, a reimagining of an older planar concept. They were a reimagining of that older concept, but they were very different from it. Typically in D&D, Davas are a race of lawful good aligned angels who canonically don't like wearing clothes. The 4th edition player character Davas were, however, like I said, a very different concept. First off, these weren't angels. They were humanoid creatures whose spirits were bound to the astral sea, and whenever they would die, they would be reincarnated somewhere else in the world or the universe with no recollection of their previous life. They had another unique element in that they were tied to the Rakshasa. If a Deva strayed from their virtues too much, upon death they'd be reincarnated as a Rakshasa instead. While this was certainly a very unique concept, and I loved these Devas as a PC, it didn't make them a counterpart to the Tieflings. It made them a counterpart to the Rakshasa, who were not playable. And the actual counterpart to the Tieflings, the Aasimar, were also still missing. And I don't know why they didn't just do Aasimar. They just not like the name, or they really like this reincarnation thing. Like someone just had this, oh, guys, I have a very cool, unique idea. Let's not do Aasimar. Let's do this one that I just invented. I don't know. But now we ended up with these two races that felt like their other half was missing for both of them. If they were to make a comeback, they would probably have to be renamed, because the actual Devas returned in 5th edition, and if we are renaming these guys, I vote Gana, because that's the original name of the soldiers of the gods in Hindu mythology. That can still be tied to reincarnation and Rakshasa. Hamadryads are certainly not an idea unique to 4th edition or D&D at all, but only 4th edition tried to make them a PC race, to my knowledge. The book called Heroes of the Feywild tried to do something different and introduced 3 races that were all very weird in their own ways. The pixies were tiny, not just small, actually tiny. And then there were 2 races that were all male, the satyrs, or all female, the hamadryads. While you hear about the pixies and the satyrs, hamadryads did kind of disappear, at least as a PC race. The hamadryad embodied the ideas of a Fey PC even more than the Eladrin, because they were explicitly dryads, spirits of nature tied to an oak tree with a supernatural charm and command. And the description the book gives you is certainly interesting. Like, listen to this. They are accustomed to having their way with mortals, okay, and sometimes have trouble understanding why they are denied what they ask for. Hamadryads, new to the world, sometimes lack the patience to absorb and mimic the extensive cultural traditions and taboos of the mortals. When their natural charm falls, frustrated hamadryads sometimes manifest their dryad aspects to unleash brute natural force. So, it's a hot lady that doesn't take no for an answer, and then goes naked and angry when she doesn't get her way. That is certainly a character of all time. One that certainly didn't get used in a weird way by socially stunted dudes. Jokes aside, I like Fey themes and Fey option for PCs, especially when they aren't trying to retcon an existing race. The gender thing with the satyrs is a little bit strange, but it's certainly something that D&D could return to. Revenants were something that was a fairly late addition to 4th edition. They came only with Heroes of Shadow, which was one of the last books released before the edition was dropped. Revenants are pretty much exactly what it says on the tin. They are people who rose back after death into this undead form. What race they were before doesn't really say. Could have been anything in theory, but the book seems to assume human. The book really ties them to the Raven Queen specifically, and even though it talks about gods of death frequently requiring agents in the mortal world, trying to sound generic, it then depicts these raven-like hands and feet and marking them as tied to the Raven Queen. As a GM, I'd like to retcon that particular aspect away if I wanted to connect them to a different death god. But it's actually one of the coolest parts of them, that really marks them as very distinct instead of just another pale, kind of semi-undead dude. The truth of the matter is, like everything to do with the Raven Queen, pretty much, we owe the Revenant race to The Crow, the infamous movie that killed its star, and which is still a great movie with a vast legacy today. Now we have the Shadar-kai who continue these themes. Revenants belong to the category of races that I feel like shouldn't really be races. I would put them alongside vampires and werewolves and mind flayers and such as a template. I believe D&D should have a small selection of these templates, these mini classes that you can take for a few levels to gain the abilities of a monster that comes from a transformation of an existing creature. As an honorable mention here that I don't think I can make a whole separate section out of is the Shade. Also from Heroes of Shadow, Shades all used to be humans until they performed a ritual that transformed them into a different creature for power. Again, it feels a little bit like this is not really a race, but it's definitely a very, very forgotten. Now, Shard Mines were probably my favorite 4th edition race. If it looks like a Protoss, I feel like there was some strong influence. They are these crystalline creatures with heavy psionic themes because they were specifically introduced to fit with the new psionic classes being added to D&D at the same time. I heard a lot of arguments that they felt too sci-fi, but honestly, all of these psionic themes are very well ingrained in D&D, so even if they don't fit your image of fantasy, they are nothing that strange to the system itself. The books gave them a very specific backstory tied to the concept called the Living Gate. This wasn't an entirely new concept, but the way 4th edition did it was very different from everything that came before or since. In essence, the Living Gate was something that existed in the distant past and locked the horrors of the Far Realm from the material plane. Until one day the gate was shattered and its shards formed into the Shard Mines. They had 3 distinct societies that approached this backstory in different ways, but Notably, all wanted to protect the material plane from the far realm. The thought builders wanted to physically build a new living gate. The godshards believed that they were the living gate, and accumulating personal power enforced the barriers to the far realm. And then there were the Shard Slayers, the token evil society that actually killed their own race because they thought that the living gate can only be restored if they're all gone. And maybe the Shard Slayers succeeded, because the Shard Mines just completely disappeared from D&D since then. Like, seriously, I have not heard anything about them, and I thought they were a pretty neat concept, with a pretty unique set of philosophies. Just about the only thing I'd change is to try to fit their idea of the living gate into more common D&D cosmology better. In my own game, I made the real living gate one of the crystal spheres from Spelljammer, which had an eldritch entity locked behind it and partially restored by one of the sects. So it's certainly workable, even if they wouldn't fit in every setting. But no race ever really fits in every setting. One of the races I'm surprised didn't make a bigger splash is the Vrylokas. It's probably because they too come from that very late Heroes of Shadow supplement, so they didn't have a lot of time to get popular before the game died. If they were given a chance though, I think they would have really taken off, because they're a kind of vampires and they have a very striking appearance. In the backstory they were given, presumably from the Points of Light base 4E setting, though it doesn't say that explicitly in the book, their elders were approached by the Red Witch, who offered them a blood bond ritual which gave them the strengths of vampires without their weaknesses. They're supposed to all look pale, and though the book describes them having more human pale colors, virtually all their art shows them with this almost alabaster white skin and blood red hair, which I always found to be a very memorable, striking appearance. They look like more than vampires, they look like definitely inhuman, and they are obviously ruled by vampire courts. So given the vampire class from the same book, you could play a Vryloka vampire and become a double vampire. Probably the most confusing part about them is the name, which on the one hand sounds like Vrykul from Warcraft, on the other hand makes me think of werewolves more than vampires. But they are certainly a race that I feel missed its chance to be something really big. A race that I guarantee most people watching will not recognize is the Wilden. Wilden? One of those. They were a race of plant-like Fae that arose to protect the Feywild from some unspecified threat, hinted at being the Far Realm, since this was the same book as Shard Mines and the Psionic classes. Now, usually when you see a race like that, plants, Fae, hunters and protectors, usually you expect some ancient keepers of secrets. But that's not what the Wilden were. They were a very new race that only recently appeared in the Feywild. Generally, culturally, we associate Fae with something old, primordial, a symbol of the old order of the world, before we came into the picture. Part of it is because humans arrive in pristine wilderness and see it existed before them. Part of it is because Fae as an idea come from mythicized ancient history of new tribes conquering the old ones. Wilden flip this idea on its head, and they feel like Mother Nature just goes, okay, yeah, you know what, that's it. I'm tired of your shit, I'm making something new to mess you up until you learn to play nice with the planet again. And not gonna lie, a part of me wants that to happen in real life, but really, Wilden offer a unique new take on an old idea. They look a little bit weird, sure, but I like weird. Another race that I will give only very brief mention to is Bladelings. And that's because I think even when 4th edition was current, people were forgetting it existed. I think it was considered very overpowered, but at the same time they were given very little lore. And sure, they looked unique, being like covered in spikes and all, but somehow they made a mix of traits that made people not resonate with them at all. If anyone listening played a Bladeling, do let me know how that went. I think that's pretty much all the races that were unique to 4th edition and haven't really seen a continuation since. There were races like Minotaurs and Pixies, but they have received some kind of content since. And then of course there are already mentioned Tieflings and Dragonborn, who really took off. I think that if 4th edition wasn't so somewhat undeservedly maligned, perhaps some of these, especially the later editions like Railokas, would have had their chance to become more common household names. But if I ever got into the Forgotten Races of 3rd edition, oh man, I would be here talking for hours. Because 3rd edition produced a lot of books, and I mean a lot. And there were races in like majority of them. Or there were a bunch of monsters you could play as races, and it's a whole huge other topic. I think that's it for this one though. 4th edition certainly was very creative and unique, and I think it died too quickly. What it really needed was to simplify some of the compounding systems that added way too many modifiers happening all at once. If it had gotten a 4.5 edition of a sort, I think it had a chance to be salvaged. And maybe if it wasn't called Dungeons and Dragons, and didn't bring the expectations with it, maybe then it would have been a more successful system. I feel like it is getting a little bit of a renaissance these days though, but unfortunately no new official material is made for it anymore. Well, did I miss anything? Did you disagree with any of my assessments? Maybe you want to comment on my brief remark about Pathfinder again instead of the actual topic of the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, maybe share what your favorite 4th edition race was. Also, channel memberships are now open, and the folks here are some of the channel supporters at the time of the video editing, so if you want to join them, get a shout out here, or early access to videos, you can click on the join button below, or maybe watch my regular nightly streams of Diablo 4 at the moment of writing. Anyway, my dear hamsterlings, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you next time.